All right, so welcome everyone. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Haruka Radobush. I'm the Senior Programs Manager at the Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Northern California, and we're excited to bring you today's virtual author talk with Susan H. Kamei, author of When Can We Go Back to America? Voices of the Japanese American Incarceration During World War II. And we are bringing you this program today as part of the Tadaima virtual community pilgrimage program that holds daily virtual programs centered around the Japanese American incarceration experience during World War II this whole month. So we're very excited to have Susan with us today to talk about her new book that just was released a week ago on September 7th. And so we do want to get into that and share everything in the book that um, will enrich everyone's understanding of this chapter of our community's history. And so with that, I want to talk about Susan a little bit to introduce you to her a bit. So Susan is an educator and teaches at the University of Southern California, where she teaches undergrads in the Dornsiff College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences about the constitutional, historical, and political issues of the Japanese American incarceration and the importance of those issues today. And she also serves as the managing director of the USC Spatial Sciences Institute as well. Susan also has a background in community advocacy and served as a member of the Japanese American Citizens League's legislative strategy team during the redress campaign as well. So she is intimately familiar with not only the topics that she researched for her book, but had an active role in part of how that history all played out for our community. So it's really an honor to have her here with us today. But I do want to give Susan a chance also to explain a little bit more about her own background as well as her family's connection to our incarceration history. So Susan, welcome.
Thank you. It's such an honor for me to get to be part of this. I think that Tadaima is such a wonderful program, and I think it's a fabulous community. It's my honor to be part of it. Thank you.
Yeah.
So the connection, of course, to the incarceration is very personal. My grandparents and parents and their families were among the incarcerees. My mother is from Little Tokyo from before the war in LA, and she and her parents were first in Santa Anita Assembly Center and then Heart Mountain. My dad and his family, his siblings, his parents, and also one set of grandparents were Orange County vegetable farmers, and they went to Poston. They went by the time they got their orders to report, the Poston camp was already open, and so they went directly to Poston. But I think my experience growing up and being Sansei, it was not very much different from others who we didn't really hear much about, if anything, about what our families' camp experiences were. It was really when I was working on the redress campaign with my father that I learned more about my own family history and then the experiences of others across the community. So that's where my appreciation for what the challenges were and what the issues were, and how much of an impact this has had on us as a community that has been intergenerational, has come from.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and so I understand that for many authors who write about this, like, yeah, it is obviously very personal. It is something that has had a profound impact on the trajectory of their entire family's lives, right? And I know that there are certainly a lot of other books that folks have written about the incarceration experience that have come out of our community, but also folks outside of our community have been writing about the incarceration as well. And I think one thing that always comes to my mind when I see another book on the list of reading that continues to grow that I need to be doing is, what is it about this book that kind of distinguishes it from the other writing that has been done on the incarceration at this point? Is there like a particular scope or perspective that you wanted to convey in your writing that we might not see in other books about the history?
Yes, definitely. There are many, many fine books that have been done and scholarly literature. And what I realized in the course of developing the materials for the class that I teach at USC is that for the most part, the other books are very topical. They focus on particular aspects of the incarceration. It might be more on the sociology and of the camp experience. It might be, there's a series of really fine books that have been done on the redress campaign, about the legislative process that it went through. There's extraordinary work that has been done by Roger Daniels and Peter Irons that are going behind the scenes with the Supreme Court cases, and then of course the Quorum Nobis effort. My book really, my research draws upon, stands on the shoulders of all of that fine research. But I think what I realized is that because they were topical, they're looking at particular slices, there wasn't any one place that tied the whole story all together and put all of that into one context that was not the Encyclopedia Britannica level of Pearl Harbor was bombed. There were these things called camps. Camps closed, people went home.
Mm-hmm.
And I also thought that that kind of scope of a book would have bought into the government false narrative that there were reasons to understand what led up to the issuance of Executive Order 9066. There certainly has been a lot written about the camps, but then the idea of it being personal and that this happened to real people and that these were personal stories is where the technique or the approach of having this history told from the perspective of individuals who were children, teenagers, young adults during the war years, and then having their biographies included so that the reader would have some context for how different people's lives were, how they handled the decisions about their feelings, about whether they would go to camp, how their families would stay together, what they were going to do afterwards during the resettlement process. All of those were very personal decisions, and there wasn't any one way that there wasn't any right way. Certainly, there wasn't any one way as a community that was monolithic. And so I think one of the goals was to also show that this was happening to real people. People had different kinds of feelings. The community was not monolithic, and that it would be irrefutable that it happened, that it's had an enduring impact. So the resources that are the back half of the books, this book is being published by the young adult imprint of Simon & Schuster that works very closely with its education and library team. And so it was also to make it readable, accessible for a student audience, also for the general public that is not interested in wading through something that would be heavy and academic. And that half of the book, the back of the half of the book, are resources. They're a glossary, a timeline, then of course, all the sources, including a bibliography that's online and a teacher's guide that is online. And so it is meant to be I was thinking of it as a map, as a wayfinding device for individuals, whether they be students or other researchers, teachers, to be able to find the primary documents and to have the URLs, in many cases, setting forth the text of various important memos. There's Senator Inouye's speech on the Senate floor, that just, put it in there and make it easy for people to find. To the extent that there were secondary sources that I could trace back and find the primary source, then I just cited to the primary source. And so it was meant to fulfill lots of different purposes, while being something that would be compelling in terms of helping people understand the experience of the incarceration and what it means today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that you, I guess, chose a format that people would be able to empathize with so much more readily than like just reading sort of a more dry academic accounting of the history. And so I know, like, just having personal narratives being presented can be much more powerful for an audience than having something just kind of explained sort of by rote to them, right? So I'm really, really appreciative that this is the approach that your big book takes. And so something that I was also wondering then, in terms of your process of doing the research and collecting these stories and narratives, was like, what are some of the topics that these personal accounts kind of cover, that you wanted to give light to, or were there things that you found that were surprising or new to you in the course of your research?
There were certainly areas that I might have been familiar with or knew had happened, and then it was really an opportunity to educate myself in terms of learning more of the detail. I think one of the important aspects of the story is what happened to the Japanese Latin Americans, and this is included in Mitchie Wagland's book Years of Infamy, and people might not understand that there was this larger global context in which the motivations to capture really and have as a what one congressman wrote, President Roosevelt, a reprisal reserve. I mean, this is really shocking that there were prisoners of war already at that point of the war, where the Japanese government was holding American citizens or captured soldiers, military, and what this concept arose that there would be a reprisal reserve of persons of Japanese ancestry that the US government could use in these prisoner of war exchanges. And that also that in part of this atmospheric security policy, that there were various arrangements between our government, the State Department, and other in the Latin American countries, in Peru in particular, to kidnap really Japanese citizens and Japanese aliens in the Latin American countries, send them under US military ship and held in Department of Justice and other detention facilities here in the US. And so it was, without trying to confuse people, also show that while we think of the camps as the War Relocation Authority camps, that there were other facilities, Department of Justice, the Army, and others, in which the detention of persons of Japanese ancestry was also taking place, and under in some cases different circumstances. So it's always more. There's always more to learn, and there's always more detail to find out. And so there's not everything that I found when it ended up going into the book, but I think in terms of trying to help readers understand also the difference between the concept of internment and what was incarceration of U.S. citizens. And so that's a thread that runs throughout the book.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of trying to cover or provide a very broad context to the whole incarceration history in your book, did you kind of have like a checklist of different topics that needed to be covered and then kind of fill in from there? Is that the general process?
Well, for the most part, it's chronological.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it was important. So one of the editors, I think was actually the publisher of the Simon Schuster imprint, who said, so I turned in chapter 5, which was the end of the camp experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then he said later, oh, but the story, you kept sending us more chapters. The story kept on going. And so this was that, that perception that, oh, the camp's closed and the story ended, right? Mm-hmm. So he said, oh, it kept going and it kept going and it kept going and it kept going. And, and it was important to me to have the opportunity to bring it through to the current day. But I think that understanding that that the story didn't start with Pearl Harbor. Uh-huh. For those of you that have the book already, you'll see that it's a flashback that I recognize, and the editors knew that if I started in the 1880s and the beginning of the Issei immigration, that we would lose people. it wouldn't start out as cinematographically.
So I think that going back to how a lot of the book is built on personal stories and narratives and accounts of the history, were there any particular stories or testimonies that you found in the course of doing your research that really made a strong impression and stuck with you after you had collected it?
Well, I'd say that the ones that were included are the ones that were very moving and powerful. It was a great opportunity to learn more about each individual, to do the research, and in as many cases as possible to contact family members for information. They're all just so interesting to me. There's some amazing stories, I think, of Nisei women who have been writers, artists, educators, community activists. It's a really great insight into some lives that we might not otherwise get to know. There is Mary Sakaguchi, who was in her first year of medical school. So I just think that's remarkable for a Nisei woman in 1941, and she's in medical school at Berkeley, and her medical school education is interrupted by the war, by being in Manzanar, but that she resumes her medical education after the war in Philadelphia at Drexel. And then she went on to be in OB for 49 years, just had this really wonderful career. And so I think it was a great example of resilience, commitment. There's one of the poets, so there's a sprinkling of poetry throughout the book. And there's a tanka that I've included by Fumiko Ogawa. And she's a very interesting, a story. She's so renowned for her poetry that she was one of the very few who were not from Japan, who was invited to the Imperial Palace, of course this is after the war, in 1957, to read to have her tanka poetry recited in the imperial court and with the audience of Emperor Hirohito. I just thought that was really, really fascinating. And then there's bios, there's quotes from, and then bios of members of the 100th and the 442nd. And just what they did in their service, and then just they resumed their quiet lives once after the war, and I think it was just really wonderful to read about what they did after the war.
Were there any stories from like your family members or close family friends that you had grown up with that you felt like needed to be put in print and preserved in some way that also made it into the book?
Yeah, so there was along the way, I had a conference in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that I would be at this conference far enough in advance that I took advantage to add a couple of vacation days before the conference to go to the National Archives and look at the War Relocation Authority files on my parents and grandparents, my dad's siblings, and actually also a couple of my uncles that were married to my aunts. And that was about all I knew I would have time for.
Mm-hmm.
And that experience was one of the most dramatic and amazing in my life. I think because of the backdrop that I had from the research for preparing and teaching my course, which is the bulk of the research that went into the book,
Mm-hmm.
I was able to, when I was looking through the files, I was able to recognize, oh, this is what that questionnaire looked like, or this is what a travel permit looked like. And so I was able to have some context for what I was seeing in their files. I was also really shocked about what was in their files.
Mm-hmm.
There were sociological assessments that were done by their school teachers on their personalities, and some of the comments in there just made me angry. And there are their medical records. I didn't realize how my grandparents had such poor health, and that my dad had a tonsillectomy in camp. And it was just, just this kind of detail. I didn't realize that one of my uncles was a no-no boy. There was files of his hearing and in quadruplicate and in his handwriting that says, "Oh, I didn't realize what I was answering. I really didn't mean it." And I just, it was just amazing. But the story that I did include in the book
Mm-hmm.
is that I had read about how after as they were getting ready to close the camps and they were trying to figure out where they would go, and this, where for the ones in the West Coast, they were orienting them to go to the Midwest, and so many went to Chicago and other places. And I had read that they couldn't officially forbid or discourage them from coming back to the West Coast, but what they would do was just to slow down the whole process, and that it was just very bureaucratic, and they just made it more difficult. They gave more support to individuals that were not coming back to the West Coast. Mm-hmm. And I had read that, but I didn't know how true it was. And then looking at the files for my paternal grandparents, mm-hmm. saw telegrams and memos and letters that were going back and forth between social work offices in Orange County that they were trying to come back to, and the Department of the Interior and different WRA offices about, oh, the Kameis want to return to Orange County, and but they had to have my aunts had to have jobs in order to get that approval. And so it was all this correspondence about, well, have they sent in that letter from that employer yet? We can't give approval until they do. Or then they eventually did get back to Orange County, but they were living in a trailer that they had left behind, and there was nothing left in it. They didn't have any furniture. They didn't even have mattresses, and they had nothing. And there's these telegrams and letters going back and forth saying they're destitute, they have nothing. There's 8 people living in this rusted trailer. They don't even have mattresses. And the responses are, well, we're very busy. Tell the Kameis to come back in another month.
Wow.
And this goes on and on and on and on. And so I just looked at that file, looked through those records in that file and realized that, well, this is that example of that kind of bureaucratic, bureaucratic morass that they found themselves in. And that went on for several months. So I was once I saw all these documents in my family's file, then I said, okay, here's an example of that happening.
Yeah, I think that's an incredible story that really highlights to me something that I find striking every time I read an account of a similar sort of like runaround that folks have gotten, when trying to resettle, or even in the process of going into the camps, right? There was just an amazing level of bureaucracy that was complicit in, stripping a whole community of their rights and their due process. And it's just amazing to me that something that inhumane, was like, I guess it necessitates that level of bureaucracy, but that in turn is, for that all to function, it's necessary for so many other people to be part of that process and that system as well. So it's really incredible to me to consider that happening on a scale that can be so uncaring and compassionate towards actual human beings. So that's an amazing story. So one other thing that I think that folks would be interested to know about your book is that you do connect it to more contemporary issues that have happened since our community's incarceration. And we often hear the adage that people who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it, or that history, if it doesn't repeat itself, then it often rhymes, right? And so I know that your book goes into some more modern parallels of the civil rights issues that are invoked in talking about our incarceration as a community, namely to things that have happened to Muslim Americans and Arab Americans, post 9/11, but also even more recently than that, with the recent Trump administration and the different policies that were discriminatory, particularly towards folks at the border during that administration, and also the sort of response that came out of the Japanese American community to those things as well. Your book goes into that a little bit as well, right? And could you maybe expand on how you cover those things in the book?
Sure. Well, I think the concept of allyship is important. That one of the quotes by Sue Kunitoni Embry, in fact, at the time of the orders, the exclusion orders, the forced removal, is that we didn't have anybody that stood up for us, that stood up with us, and that whether it's among the Quakers or various religious groups or progressive-minded individuals at that time, there just wasn't enough of an impact of their opinions against this wave of public fear and prejudice that just became overwhelming. And so I think this comes out in the actions of Minyasui and Gordon Hirabayashi and Fred Korematsu, that at the time they felt like they were very much standing alone. And so bringing that forward, that how the Japanese American community has stood with the Muslim American community after 9/11, and then you mentioned the Trump administration, Muslim bans, and those 3 successive executive orders. and the Trump versus Hawaii case that was a Supreme Court decision, and it stirred up a whole nother level of what Eric Yamamoto calls the ghost of Korematsu. And this recurrence of confusion over what the Korematsu and the other wartime cases stood for, and how it's been interpreted, misinterpreted, really, and applied to current cases that are coming, that have come, and I'm sure will still come before the Supreme Court. And so it's I think at the end of the book, an opportunity to at least create a little awareness about the importance of allyship, and the invitation to think about how this has happened. So for instance, you take the activity at the border, and what I've heard in some of the the discussion and the controversy that, well, these are aliens, and so they're trying to come into our country, and this is different, right? And I just would like to suggest that, well, 2/3 of those who were incarcerated were American citizens, and that the rationale to include American citizens in the orders that followed Executive Order 9066 were on the basis of the ability to confuse, to blur the distinction between the Issei who were not legally able to become citizens, who were therefore classified and could only be aliens, and then what the orders referred to as non-aliens. So what's a non-alien? And so this distinction between the rights of someone who's not a citizen and someone who is a citizen was blurred, and that's actually part of the reference to the title of the book. And so I think that's the cautionary tale that we need to be vigilant. And eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, carved on the walls of the National Archives, because it's so easy to go down what we say in the law, the slippery slope.
Absolutely. And knowing that your book is brand new, it just came out a week ago, right? Are you currently planning a tour to take the book around and make appearances and have the chance for folks to meet you in person and have you sign their copies?
Yes. Yeah, well, we thought COVID would be done by now.
I wish.
Actually the publication date got pushed out in large part because everything in publishing shut down at first when the pandemic first hit, and then it was something of a strategic throw the ball down the field, thinking that, oh, surely by the fall of 2021 we could be doing book talks and book tour the way we've all thought about that. I do intend to do that. All the events with organizations through the fall, through the winter and end of the year, are all virtual. But the first in-person, Laura was mentioning Duncan Williams, the first in-person event that we're counting on being able to hold will be at USC, at the USC Doheny Library, sponsored by the USC Ito Center. And it's going to be, I'm really excited about it. It's going to feature music, art, and some poetry from the book as a context for readings from the book. And that will be what I'm hoping will be the first in-person event. And then I hope to schedule San Francisco. We were talking about Seattle, Tacoma earlier, Seattle, Tacoma, Salt Lake City, some other places that people have already asked about and invited, doing the sweep here through Southern California as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that event at USC sounds like it'll be really quite a production. So hopefully that can be pulled off without any complications from the pandemic. But certainly, if you come up to San Francisco, let me know. And
Oh, I definitely will come to San Francisco. Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
great.
yeah, yeah,
All right.
yeah.
And I actually have one final question before we get into our audience Q&A questions for you. And this is kind of going back to the title of the book, When Can We Go Back to America? So that in itself is an interesting title, right? Because it evokes questions about like who is asking this question, like why would they be asking such a question, right? And for you personally, do you feel like we're at a point where you can say to the rest of our community, yes, we can go back to America, or is there a sort of an idealized America that we can go back to that we're working our way back towards?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, we explained it in the book flap where the title comes from, and I talk about it a little bit in my intro. So there's a story that is supposed to have circulated among the various camps. It's in a camp newsletter, and it's reported, and it's hard to know whether the story is actually true or not, but it circulated around as perhaps a camp. It's one of those camp mythologies or camp myths. And in some cases, it's told about a little boy. In some cases, it's told about a little girl. I chose to make it a girl. And it's that when the families went into the camps, whether it's Assembly Center or the War Relocation Authority camps, that for the first time, they're surrounded by everyone who's all Japanese. So instead of what they would see in their neighborhoods, then suddenly they're just all in a very overwhelmingly, completely uniform sea of Japanese faces. And so the story is that this child mistakenly thinks that her parents have taken her to Japan and asks her mother one afternoon something along the lines of, "Mommy, I don't like it here. When can we go home? When can we go back to America?" Now, with the notion that as a child, that would have been a Nisei, so someone who is American born, and how the rights of the Nisei as US citizens were not honored. And so to me, it was this larger metaphorical question about when would they be able to go back to an America that honored their constitutional rights? And so, to your point, have we gone back there? No, I think that's part of what this book is about. We need to keep up that fight. We need to be aware of how our civil liberties get eroded with the quest of protecting national security. So that's today's phrase for the phrase that was used in the World War II times of military necessity. And I would have come to think of this, would like to offer that the human reaction to fear is to try to find a place to target our emotion to that fear, to have an enemy or some place to blame or something to blame or somebody to blame. I have experienced this as the designated blamee. And so I think as a society, there is this, and I recognize that in the war, there was intense fear. During COVID, there's been intense fear. And that what has happened to our Asian American community, we've been the designated blamee because there have been those that have fostered this idea of the Chinese flu or the Kung flu. And then anyone who looks Asian and sometimes mistakenly Asian then has become that part of that designated blamee, right, for that fear. So I think as a society, we band together to come up with healthier, more compassionate, more sensitive ways to handle this human emotion of fear, and not to create enemies or to treat one another as enemies as a function of that fear. So so that question about when can we go back to America, I think, is when do we go back to the America where under the Constitution everyone's rights get the protection that they deserve?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. That was such a wonderful answer to that question, and I think it really encapsulates, the core message, behind the book itself, right, and why it's really worth people taking a look into what our community experienced, and makes them ponder that question for themselves, right?
So let me tell you, I did a interview that aired on a week ago, Tuesday, on NPR's affiliate, The Takeaway in New York. And we were talking in the green room about how I was honored that Secretary Mineta joined me in that interview for some of it, and immediately after and it went national, and not long after it started airing, I started getting reports from friends and family across the country that, oh, they heard it in Texas, they heard it in New York, they heard it in, they heard it here, they heard it in San Francisco or wherever. And I got a direct message on my Facebook account from someone that said, heard the clip on NPR, and said I was wrong. Everybody's rights during the war were protected.
Really?
So
and said that?
yeah. Yeah. Well, Tom's comment. Yeah. Well, American experience when moving to a city outside of camp. Yeah. Well, so there are those that, and I include this in the book a bit, that that the argument was, well, this was for their own good. They were protected. They were living on the government dole, and before the Nisei young men were able to volunteer, and then later were subject to the draft, that there was a criticism that, well, our boys are out there putting themselves at risk and giving their lives in the war effort, and the folks that look like the enemy are sitting safe and sound inside a camp. So,
well, I think we're at the time where the audience has been eagerly awaiting their chance to ask you some of their own questions, and I know that we've had a couple come into the chat, so why don't we go ahead and get into that? And if anyone else in the audience has additional questions that they'd like to ask Susan, definitely enter them into the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen there, and we'll read them out loud for her to respond to. Okay, so we'll go to the first question in the Q&A, and let's see, we have a question from Laura in the audience, and she says, I noticed you included a couple of stories from the Japanese Christian Oral History Project with Rhoda Nishimura, Yoya, and Jun Toshiyuki. So Laura has copies of the cassette recordings, and would it be useful to digitize them or to finish transcribing them, to publish them as ebooks on a website?
Yeah, I was so excited to see that comment, Laura. I would love to hear them. I think, so I've seen, there was, so I found the materials that they were transcribed and printed. But I would be delighted to learn what is, what's in the cassettes. One of the things that in working with Densho, so many of the videos and documents are in the Densho repository. and their digital archives. And I think they and I'm sure also the museum, the Japanese American National Museum, would love to have, if they don't already, would love to have the audio as well. So yeah, let's talk about that. I think one of the realizations about the quotes and the bios and the stories is that so much of those materials, so much of those oral histories, those videos are out there. They're on the various Nisei veterans sites. They're easily accessible on Densho. But you have to sort through, you have to go through, there's really an overwhelming amount of material in order to pull out different examples or to pull out different stories. And so that was part of what I was hoping the book would help do. But certainly I know a lot of people have been looking at their own family photos and sending them to me, and I think this would be a great, if it's a great motivation to dig out those family files and digitize them and share them and discover Nikkei or with sources like Densho, that would be a great contribution.
And certainly if there are other questions from the audience, feel free to submit them. I have another question for Susan while we entertain additional questions from the audience. So Susan, I know that when we were initially setting up this session today, you had mentioned that part of the genesis of your book in part came from just teaching in a classroom setting, right? These histories. So can you kind of explain to us how the book kind of came out of that classroom setting and context?
So a week ago, when it was launch day, my local bookstore here in Pasadena, Romans, hosted the launch day virtual event. And my conversation partner was Teresa Watanabe, who's one of the education reporters and Sansei with the Los Angeles Times. And Teresa typically covers something in the Japanese American community that is related to the incarceration around the time in mid-February, around the time of Day of Remembrance, February 19. And so the first year that I taught this course at USC that I created was Teresa covered my course as her Day in Remembrance article. Mm-hmm. And as a function of that article, so how the opportunity for me to get to do a book with a publisher of the stature of Simon & Schuster is completely atypical. A lot of people ask me, so how did you do that? And it was that I think the short story is to share is that their young adult imprint had a series of books on important times of history and important people in history. Mm-hmm. Those books were quite small and meant to be introductions for students to the topic, like the Boston Tea Party or figures such as Nelson Mandela. And so there was an idea, there was the commitment that, of course, they were calling it the internment, that the Japanese American internment would be one of those important episodes that they might include in this series. They contacted me because they saw the article that Teresa had done on the course. They were interested in someone who was from the community and had some experience in talking about the material from an educational standpoint. And then, one thing led to another.
Mm-hmm. So in teaching the incarceration history, particularly to an audience that might not be as intimately connected to that history as, Japanese Americans and descendants of camp survivors might be, What do you find is like the most challenging aspect of the camp experience to convey to non-Nikkei audiences?
Yeah, so thank you. This was a lot of the work in the editorial process, because the editors, the various editors, there were lots of editors. The various editors are not familiar with, are not Japanese American, and so it's actually a very good check, because there's so much. It wasn't just about the camp experience; it was about really the Issei Nisei culture. And the generational differences, and the just the complexity of especially for the Issei of still preserving and wanting to keep their customs, what was important to them, alive here in America. The Nisei, of course, growing up, having one foot in each world, and explaining that, or having that be as part of the backdrop for an audience that did not grow up with it and is not familiar with it. That's where the glossary came in, because there's Japanese words that are familiar for Sansei even, but and that we might otherwise take for granted. There are Japanese words that are embedded in the quotes, in the testimonies, and so there was a lot of effort on my part, and in terms of the questions that the editors would ask about. Okay, well, like the idea of what a baishokunin is with arranged marriages, right? Or the concept of a picture bride. And so it was, okay, break this down so that someone who's never heard of this before could get a clue, could have some understanding. And then to try to understand what it meant for, say, I'll just give one example, the Nisei young men in camp who wanted to volunteer, and how upset in some cases their Issei fathers were, because they thought, well, here I've lost everything, and this government's put us in prison, and you're all I have. And what if you go off and you don't come home? And I'd rather have you, and others that felt, oh, that would send their sons off and say, don't embarrass us. I'd rather have you die with honor than live as a coward. So there's a lot of heavy, a lot of heavy things. But for those of us that grew up with this, we understand and we relate to that. But it's try to explain that to the non-Japanese audience.
Right.
Definitely.
Well, I don't see any particular. Oh, maybe we have one more question here in the chat. Just came in.
Yeah, there's a bit about the camp governance that Tom is asking about. Do you touch on the younger men who are given block manager roles and other leadership roles, and not to the older men and after the camp life for the younger men? Yeah, I do touch on that a little bit. That there were the issues that the Caucasian camp directors and leadership felt more comfortable dealing with the Nisei who spoke English natively. There were Issei that did speak English, and along the way got some leadership positions. But yes, there certainly were those generational issues, and also the issues that arose with the camp administration. I didn't go into, at a certain point, you just have to recognize, where would you lose people with too much detail in the stories. But one of the things that I realized just reading different experiences at different camps is that the policies in the camps could really vary, and it would vary a lot by who the project director was of the camp. Some were much more lenient than others. And atmosphere within the different camps varied as well.
Do we have any final questions for Susan? So it'll be our last chance to submit questions. And again, I think, you know, folks should definitely take a look at the book and, you know, get a sense of, you know, the experiences through the stories that are captured in the book. But, you know, as Susan was mentioning, this book is also meant for a broader audience to understand better our community's history of incarceration, and for, you know, either, you know, younger generations of our families who haven't had to personally experience this. I'm sure this would be helpful in giving them that perspective, but also for our non-Nikkei friends and family members as well. Certainly think that this would be a useful resource for them to be able to connect with our community's history as well. But with that being said, I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our program, and especially thank Susan for sharing her experience writing this book, and everything that went into researching and writing it as well. And we're really looking forward to seeing the tour for the book and seeing it, you know, disseminated into the general public, so that everyone can benefit from everything instilled in there. So with that, I just wanted to give you a chance to make any closing remarks for our audience today, Susan. And again, thank you everyone else for being with us. But Susan.
Sure. Thank you. I would like to make one pitch here, is that once you've had a chance to see the book, and I hope that you'll find it to be an important resource for students and teachers, and that you could help out by asking your local public libraries, your school districts, to consider getting the book and to having it as a resource. So some folks are starting to do that, and it would be great to have it available for students and teachers. And I do intend to come up to the Bay Area. Probably my daughter lives in Redwood City. Oh, my parents-in-law are in Palo Alto. So I consider the Bay Area very familiar territory, and would absolutely love to do an in-person event there at sometime near in the future. I'm also looking forward to getting to do the Heart Mountain pilgrimage in person sometime soon. And I really appreciate all of you who have joined in tonight and have been part of the conversation, and would really look forward to hearing from you more, and hopefully getting to talk with you and meet with you in person sometime soon.
Great, thank you, Susan. And for everyone else, please do check out the rest of our daily program schedule for Tadaima at jampilgrimages.com/Tadaima2021. We just announced that we have extended Tadaima this year by another week of programs. So certainly a lot more new content up there to check, and hopefully you will be able to catch some of it as well yourselves. But with that being said, thank you all again for being with us. Stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll see you again soon. All right.
Thank you.
Good night.